Welcome to True Crime Threads, where we unravel the dark twists of real-life crime stories. Today, we dive into the chilling tale of a husband who killed for wealth and tried to frame his own daughter. At first glance, the Johnson family appeared perfect. Jack Johnson, a successful businessman, and his wife, Samar, seemed to have it all: wealth, a luxurious home, and a young daughter, Lily, who was the center of their world. Their marriage seemed solid, built on years of shared dreams and a deep bond. The couple enjoyed an extravagant lifestyle, often hosting lavish parties at their sprawling estate and attending high-profile events in the city. Their life, at least from the outside, was the epitome of success. However, beneath the surface, things weren't as idyllic as they seemed. Jack's career had been a series of ambitious ventures that often teetered on the edge of ethical boundaries. While he had made a name for himself in business, his financial dealings were not as transparent as they appeared. His investments were risky, and his debts were mounting. Samar, on the other hand, was a kind and caring woman who worked tirelessly on various charitable causes, but she had no idea how deeply Jack's financial troubles were beginning to affect him. Samar had always trusted her husband, believing he had the best intentions. But what she didn't know was that Jack was hiding a dark secret, one that could destroy everything they had built together. Jack's need for control and wealth had grown insatiable, and he had been plotting for months to secure his financial future. Samar's fortune, which she had inherited from her late parents, was worth millions. Despite her generosity, Samar had recently updated her will, leaving everything to Jack, with only a small portion set aside for Lily. But Jack wanted it all, and he was willing to do anything to get it. In the weeks leading up to Samar's disappearance, Jack began to grow increasingly anxious. Samar had become suspicious of his behavior and had confided in her closest friends that she was considering a major change in their marriage. She had expressed doubts about Jack's loyalty, sensing that he was no longer the man she had married. Samar had even made plans to consult with a divorce lawyer, fearing Jack had been hiding things from her. Unbeknownst to her, Jack knew this was the beginning of the end for his access to her wealth. On the evening of her disappearance, Samar and Jack had an argument. It was nothing out of the ordinary for a couple facing tension, but it marked the last time anyone would see her alive. Samar left their bedroom, visibly upset, and walked into the living room, where she spent the rest of the night. The next morning, she was gone. Jack claimed that he had gone to bed early and hadn't seen Samar after their argument, but that her car was missing. When he woke up, Samar had vanished without a trace. Police were immediately called, and the investigation began. There were signs of a struggle in the house, but no clues as to where Samar had gone. Jack seemed devastated, his tears appearing genuine as he spoke to investigators. He gave several interviews, pleading for Samar's safe return and emphasizing how much he loved her. But detectives were suspicious. His calm demeanor and lack of clear details raised questions. He couldn't recall any specific details about their argument, and the timeline of events seemed disjointed. Though Jack appeared heartbroken, something about his behavior didn't quite add up. Little did anyone know, this was just the beginning of a twisted plan. As the investigation unfolded, clues would slowly reveal the shocking truth behind Samar's disappearance. Jack, the grieving husband, had orchestrated the perfect crime to inherit his wife's fortune. The investigation would soon uncover dark secrets and twisted motives that no one could have anticipated. As the days passed, the search for Samar continued. The police scoured the city, hoping to find any sign of the missing woman, but there were no leads. Jack, although initially cooperative, began to show signs of unease. He remained the picture of a grieving husband, but his actions were beginning to raise suspicions. He was constantly on edge, nervously asking investigators for updates, but his emotions seemed controlled, almost rehearsed. His face betrayed no deep sorrow, only an unsettling calmness. While his concern for Samar appeared genuine to those who didn't know him well, detectives began to notice that something didn't feel right. The police decided to dig deeper into Jack's personal life, examining his past financial dealings and any possible motives for Samar's disappearance. They uncovered a pattern of risky investments and mounting debts that Jack had kept hidden from Samar. There were whispers of infidelity, with rumors suggesting that Jack had been involved in an affair, though no concrete evidence emerged. Still, it became clear that Samar had been more than just a wife to Jack. She had been his lifeline. Without her fortune, Jack's empire might crumble. The detectives began to wonder if Samar's disappearance had less to do with her leaving and more to do with her being silenced permanently. As the investigation into Jack's finances grew more intense, the police turned their attention to the couple's daughter, Lily. At only 9 years old, Lily had witnessed more than any child should. She had been the last person to see Samar, and the detectives hoped that she might provide some crucial details. They spoke with Lily several times, gently asking her about the events of that night. Lily recalled hearing her parents argue in their bedroom, though she couldn't remember the specifics. She seemed to avoid eye contact when asked about her mother's whereabouts, and this made the investigators uneasy. It wasn't that Lily was being dishonest, rather. There was something about her behavior that suggested fear. The police brought in a child psychologist to help with the questioning. Through careful and patient conversations, Lily opened up about a strange interaction she had with her father after Samar went missing. She told the psychologist that Jack had seemed unusually calm, almost too calm, when he spoke about her mother. He told Lily that Samar had left, though the young girl couldn't understand why. She was too young to fully grasp the gravity of the situation, but she sensed that her father wasn't being truthful. Investigators also found that the timeline Jack had provided didn't quite add up. According to him, he had gone to bed early that night, unaware of Samar's plans. But the evidence didn't support his version of events. Security cameras in the neighborhood showed Jack leaving the house late that evening, something he had failed to mention in his initial statements. When confronted with this evidence, Jack quickly changed his story, claiming he had gone for a late-night drive to clear his mind. However, the police were not convinced. Despite Jack's insistence that he had no idea where Samar had gone, more and more evidence pointed toward him as the prime suspect. The missing person case was beginning to look more like a homicide investigation. The detectives began to suspect that Jack had not only orchestrated Samar's disappearance but was now trying to manipulate the investigation to his advantage. As the case progressed, it became clear that Jack was hiding something far darker than anyone could have imagined. The story of a grieving husband was unraveling, revealing a man driven by greed, desperation, and a willingness to go to any lengths to cover his tracks. As the investigation progressed, the detectives uncovered more disturbing details about Jack's life. The deeper they dug into his background, the clearer it became that his marriage to Samar had not been as perfect as it appeared. Samar had always been the kind of person who kept her personal struggles private, but recently she had begun to confide in close friends about her growing concerns regarding Jack. She had suspected that Jack was hiding things from her, and their marriage had become strained. Samar had been quietly making plans to leave him. She had already consulted a divorce lawyer, though she hadn't yet shared her decision with Jack. There were whispers of Jack's financial troubles, which Samar had never been fully aware of. It turned out that Jack had been using Samar's fortune to cover his debts, and the couple's wealth was not as secure as it seemed. Detectives also discovered that Samar had recently altered her will, changing the beneficiaries of her estate. Jack had been the primary heir, but Samar had decided to leave a substantial portion of her fortune to charity and to Lily, leaving Jack with a much smaller share than he had anticipated. The thought of losing control over Samar's wealth sent Jack into a spiral of anxiety. He knew that without Samar's money, his extravagant lifestyle and business ventures would collapse. As investigators pieced together the timeline, it became evident that Jack had been planning his wife's death for some time. A breakthrough came when forensic experts examined the blood found at the crime scene. Traces of Samar's blood were discovered in Jack's car trunk, a critical piece of evidence that linked him directly to the crime. When confronted with this new evidence, Jack's demeanor shifted. He tried to maintain his innocence, but the walls were closing in. The detectives believed that he had staged Samar's disappearance to make it look like she had simply run away. But the forensic evidence told a different story. Samar hadn't left on her own, she had been murdered. The pressure mounted on Jack, and the detectives soon found more incriminating evidence. Security footage from the neighborhood revealed Jack driving to a secluded area late that night, around the time Samar was last seen. His calmness throughout the investigation now seemed out of place, especially as more details of his actions came to light. The detectives also learned that Jack had contacted several of his business associates shortly after Samar's disappearance, inquiring about the status of his finances and his inheritance. It was clear that he was already thinking about what would happen once Samar's fortune became his. In the midst of all this, Jack's daughter, Lily, became an even more critical figure in the investigation. As the only living witness to the night's events, Lily's testimony could hold the key to unraveling the truth. She had mentioned that she saw her father acting strangely the morning after Samar's disappearance. Lily's recollections were fragmentary, but the details she provided helped the detectives piece together the final moments leading to Samar's murder. Though Jack had tried to convince the police that Lily was too young to understand what had happened, her observations were crucial in making the case against him stronger. As the evidence mounted, Jack's facade began to crack. The picture of the grieving husband, devastated by the sudden loss of his wife, was beginning to look more like a carefully constructed lie. Samar's disappearance was no longer just a missing person case, it was a murder investigation, and Jack was the prime suspect. The police were closing in, and it was only a matter of time before they had enough evidence to charge him with the crime. Jack's desperation grew as the truth slowly but surely came to light. Jack's plan to frame Lily grew more desperate as the investigation into Samar's disappearance progressed. With every passing day, the pressure on him intensified, and he realized that his lies were beginning to unravel. The detectives were getting closer, and he had to act fast if he wanted to avoid the consequences of his actions. In a shocking turn, Jack began to manipulate the situation in a bid to shift suspicion away from himself and onto his young daughter. He planted evidence in their home, trying to make it appear as though Lily had somehow been involved in Samar's disappearance. Jack staged a scene in the living room, scattering items around to make it look like Lily had been in some sort of distress. He placed blood-stained clothing in her bedroom, hoping to convince the investigators that she had been hiding something. He even went so far as to suggest that Lily had been acting strangely since the night Samar went missing. He hoped that by portraying his daughter as a troubled child, investigators might think she had accidentally harmed her mother in a fit of rage. The plan was risky, and Jack knew that the police would eventually see through his scheme, but in his panic he was willing to do anything to avoid being caught. He had already begun to distance himself from Lily emotionally, becoming cold and distant toward her. He told her that her mother had left and wasn't coming back, refusing to offer her any emotional support. Jack knew that the best way to divert attention from his own guilt was to manipulate his daughter's grief. However, Lily's innocence began to shine through. The detectives, already suspicious of Jack's behavior, grew even more convinced that the situation wasn't as it seemed. They decided to conduct another round of interviews with Lily, this time focusing more on her interactions with her father. The young girl, frightened and confused, struggled to comprehend the full scope of the situation, but she began to remember small details that would later prove crucial. She described how her father had seemed unnervingly calm and detached in the days following her mother's disappearance, which stood in stark contrast to the way a grieving father would typically act. The police also took a closer look at the evidence Jack had planted. While it initially seemed to support his narrative, forensic experts quickly disproved his claims. The bloodstains in Lily's room didn't match Samar's blood type, and the supposed signs of a struggle were inconsistent with what would be expected in a violent confrontation. It became clear that Jack had staged the scene in an attempt to throw the investigators off the trail, but the inconsistencies were too obvious to ignore. Meanwhile, Lily's testimony was proving invaluable. Despite her age, her recollections were sharp, and her innocent observations added another layer of clarity to the case. She remembered seeing her father act strangely on the night of Samar's disappearance, recalling that he had been unusually calm when he told her that her mother was gone. She also mentioned how Jack had spoken about Samar's absence as if it was a temporary situation, something that didn't make sense given the circumstances. As the detectives pieced together the pieces of the puzzle, they realized that Jack's plan to frame his daughter had failed miserably. Instead of shifting the blame onto Lily, his actions only made him appear more guilty. The mounting evidence, combined with Lily's testimony, finally brought the truth to light. Jack's desperate attempt to cover up his crime by implicating his own daughter had backfired, and the investigation was quickly moving toward a conclusion. The case had taken a dark and unexpected turn. What had initially seemed like the disappearance of a woman had turned into a cold-blooded murder, and Jack's involvement was undeniable. The detectives were closing in on him, and there was no escape. Jack's fate was sealed, and the only question now was whether he would finally admit to his crimes or continue to deny his involvement in the face of overwhelming evidence. Jack's world was rapidly collapsing around him as the detectives tightened their grip. The mounting evidence against him had made it clear that his days of freedom were numbered. Despite his earlier attempts to manipulate the investigation and cast blame on his young daughter, the truth was undeniable. The forensic evidence, Lily's testimony, and his own inconsistent story all pointed to one horrific conclusion: Jack had murdered his wife for her fortune, and he had tried to frame his own daughter to cover it up. As the final pieces of the puzzle fell into place, Jack's demeanor changed drastically. The once calm facade he had maintained throughout the investigation began to crack, revealing the desperation beneath. No longer able to maintain the illusion of innocence, Jack finally broke down during an interrogation. The detectives had prepared for this moment, carefully leading him through the facts, allowing him to realize that there was no escape. The investigators presented him with the overwhelming evidence they had gathered. The blood found in his car, the inconsistencies in his story, the planted evidence in Lily's room, all of it painted a clear picture of a man driven by greed and a twisted desire to take control of his wife's wealth. As Jack sat in the interrogation room, his shoulders slumped, and he began to cry. It was the first time anyone had seen him genuinely emotional since Samar's disappearance. His tears were not of grief, but of fear and guilt. Unable to maintain his charade any longer, Jack confessed. He explained how he had meticulously planned Samar's murder, knowing that without her fortune his life would fall apart. He had convinced himself that he needed her wealth to survive, that he could not bear the thought of losing everything he had worked so hard to gain. Jack admitted to luring Samar into a confrontation, during which he had killed her in a fit of rage. He then tried to cover his tracks, making it appear as if she had simply run away, all while secretly disposing of her body in a secluded area. Jack's confession was chilling, as he described the cold and calculated way he had carried out his plan. What was even more disturbing was his lack of remorse. He didn't seem to fully grasp the depth of his crime. His focus remained on his own self-preservation, as if he was more concerned about the consequences for himself than the life he had taken. But Jack's manipulation didn't end with the murder. His attempt to frame Lily had been one of the most twisted aspects of his plan. He had sought to shift the blame onto his young daughter, hoping to confuse the investigators and create doubt. But the detectives saw through his scheme, and Lily's innocence had been the key to unraveling the truth. The young girl had been terrified by her father's actions, and the investigators knew that she had been nothing more than a pawn in Jack's desperate attempt to avoid responsibility for his crime. As Jack was arrested and led away in handcuffs, the full scope of his actions began to sink in. His wife was dead, and he had tried to destroy his daughter's life in the process. Lily, though traumatized, was now safe. The case that had begun with the disappearance of a woman had ended with the shocking revelation of a man who was willing to sacrifice everything, including his own flesh and blood, for greed. The trial that followed was a media sensation, with the details of Jack's betrayal and manipulation captivating the public. Jack was convicted of Samar's murder, and his attempts to frame Lily only made his crimes seem more heinous. The family that once appeared perfect was shattered, leaving behind a legacy of tragedy and deceit. Jack's life was over, and the world watched as the man who had tried to get away with murder was finally held accountable for his actions.